Looks like we are on the air, and let us begin our cute little clickety clack, our analog world digital platform. Welcome to Evolution Hour, and don't forget our cute little WordPress.com, which is in fact a. Why have I suddenly lost my window again? Okay, there we go. Once in a while, it suddenly jumps up to fill the screen, and I have to hunt around for all the little bits. Again, we're slightly late today because it's been a busy little day. Oh, so many little things going on. In fact, I've added kind of a third part to our show today, which will be a discussion of the research that I've been doing for Rocks Were There Volume 2 on the cosmology chapter relating to the Anthropic argument. And some interesting little twists and turns, and all comes from when one starts asking questions and making charts. But remember, the big thing is, of course, we are looking at Titans, our wonderful little creationist book that continues to not amaze us in terms of just kind of banging the drums and repeating the tropes. And this, of course, is also a Casey Luskin week. So we will be bringing more. And the thing that I promised 2 weeks ago, which is the Staufen matter, falling through on a particular biological issue that shows up in a bunch of different things on the Luskin list. And we're grouping them all together in one little lump. It's been a process that's been a fun little detail to work out. And spoiler alert, it's still not helping their case any. So first off, step one are Sarfati they're trying to play the taphonomy issue, which is how do fossils get preserved under what circumstances. And to no surprise, regular paleontology is well aware of the fact that most fossils can't easily form. That's why most things aren't represented by fossils, that you have to have them buried in some context, but this does not require floods, would involve a very specific set of taphonomic results. Mass graveyards would be ubiquitous in the fossil record. They aren't. And it's interesting to find out whether even creationists think that they are all that common. The vast majority of fossils are little bits and pieces of stuff, and they're not covered over with soft tissue, etc., etc. At any rate, our creationists have to maneuver around this point. So they've got a couple papers, one from 2016 and one from 2014. The first is on some experiments where people were trying to figure out how quickly things decay in a marine environment. So they use some pig carcasses, and surprise, surprise, they take a while, but not a hell of a long time for them to be disintegrated. Perfectly fine little work. So that's in my master listing for Sarfati and Tay under, they're citing it. They're not misrepresenting it. It's okay. Second paper is quite a different kettle of fish. Simon Salisbury from 2014 is on a related thing, but specifically about paleontology, which was not mainly the topic of the Anderson and Bell thing. They were talking about crocodile carcasses, all would get in there, how much bloating would occur to the surface before they get brought down, why are things deteriorated the way they are, etc., etc. Now you have to go all the way down through to the conclusion section to discover that they are along the way explicitly discussing how fossilization can also occur in stagnant conditions. And therefore, the argument that only catastrophic burial is going to be the cause of fossil deposits, their paper explicitly is pointing out with source citations the opposite. So this one goes in a different category. This one clearly relates to them shuffleboarding the work. And in fact, they're kind of citing it on a sidebar issue solely on the matter of this bloating bit. It reminds us of the primary bit that if a creationist goes out of their way to cite a non-creationist, look it up, because odds are, one, you're going to learn stuff, and two, you're going to find out that it's not actually supporting their position and they're misrepresenting it. It's rather ubiquitous thing. So it's a nice little cottage industry. And because we have the internet, One available was available as Sci-Hub, and the other one is a PLOS paper. So all of those are open access. So it's not something that requires you to have steam coming out of your ears in exhaustion to be able to locate. We now live in a time when most technical papers on most subjects available somewhere freebie. So it requires zero cost, but just a little bit of effort to track them down. And bear in mind that you should want to not assume that just because you can't find a full text item right off the bat, keep searching to change the terminology. I tend to hunt things up by the title of the paper, or at times, sometimes I need to parse it down to a section of the paper. And not only will it tend to pull out material where you're looking around to find out if somebody has got a full text matter on it, but also you're bringing up other literature that relates to the topic. Then if I want to find out whether creationists have specifically addressed the thing, then I can phrase it a little differently. I'll tag in creationism into the field and alter some of my search bits to try to whittle things out, find out whether or not anybody has discussed it. Because remember, most of the technical literature isn't getting surveyed in the creationist literature. So you need to kind of locate that to kind of measure better about how they're dealing stuff. Anyway, now on to the Luskin list, which I'll get that out of the way before I hit off to my Anthropic update. And I'm not seeing anybody in the live chat yet. So these are presumably people will be catching me in my modest little audience after the fact. There's a Staufen1 binding issue, which is apparently a really interesting one, because I even had some technical papers on it in my reference field before bumping into this little sidebar. Another little element that's unusual about these examples is they are not particularly current. Only one of them dates from the 2020s, and just barely 2020. And most of the material that's been vomited on the Luskin list has involved stuff that's quite current in the 2020s. So suddenly we're getting a bunch of stuff from 2013, 2014, 2016, 2018 that I suspect was on somebody's little siphon list that then got dumped as a blob, because most of these are in a group, but kind of farther downstream. And it's only because I was struck by the specific topic of this Staufen1 that I'm going to find out whether there are any other papers on the subject to see whether or not they're bumping into it again. And it turned out they are, because there's a bunch of them. The oldest one, Gong 20 et al. 2013, clearly is on quite early research, and they're encountering the fact that this thing is processing stuff in relation to ALUs. Duh. But remember, merely because an ALU is involved doesn't mean that most ALUs are doing something. That's a very specific, contrary side issue that the papers in question, unless they are explicitly pointing that out, and so far we have not found a single paper that is jumping on the notion that they are contending that the majority of ALUs, let alone most of them, or let alone all, are actually functional. They are simply pointing out, quite rightly, that some do stuff, and that's not anything that's a big shocker in the biological field. The next paper, 2013, Park and McWay, is specifically about mammalian ones, because it turns out ALUs are all over the place in animal life. They're not restricted to us. There's counterparts of them over among flies, for example, Drosophila. Some of the papers are involved with ones that I'm primarily citing in here. Presumably, they're relating to either mammals or humans. That's what was triggering them getting on the Luskin list. Anyway, they were noting that ALUs are involved, and they indicated even a percentage that maybe 4 to 13% of the targets that they were looking at have some ALUs involved. And but that, again, was in no way translated into thinking that most of them are showing up as being functional. The next paper, Riki et al. 2014, was really quite intriguing, because it's discussing a bit more of the background. They're explicitly noting that they are double-stranded RNAs, which is a very specialized little element about that, which in the back of my brain, I'm going, that's kind of intriguing, because RNAs are typically single-stranded, just as DNA runs typically double-stranded, but there are also exceptions to the rule. So you have some double-stranded RNAs in biology, triple-stranded DNA, things where the things are connecting up in multiple layers. And that's a interesting little sidebar that has been explored a little bit in the literature, but not, I think, nearly enough, because I suspect these elements about the ability of those components of nucleic acids to be able to slice together and form multiple segments may be a clues to what's going on in the earliest system when all of this stuff is emerging to begin with, and that's long before Luca is coming along. A little hobby horse and a suspicion that I have that we'll just put that as a little sidebar pin. Then there's the 2014 paper from De Lucas et al. ALUs are showing up as in towards the end of the paper as, again, part of the mix. And that Staufen, this little particular thing, can connect with it, can link up with ALUs. But we already know that ALUs have a very prolific capacity to link up with other components. That's why they spread around and cause conformation changes inside of the molecules, the reason why we don't have tails, as we pointed out in earlier episodes. Then Bondi-Chorny et al. 2016. That's where we hit the recurring theme that I keep track of, and that is the theodicy problem. Because this one, its lab puts a smack dab on that, because it is about how it and the ALUs act as a disease modifier. In this case, it's myotonic dystrophy. Sometimes it's in a positive way to ameliorate it, sometimes in a negative way to enhance it, which means if they were designed, then it's a clumsy designer that doesn't know what the effect of all of this stuff is. So that one gets smack dab on the theodicy column, and we've been running a little under 1/3 of the papers that they've cited so far hit the theodicy angle. Boy, Luskin and company really ought to be more careful about what topics they try to bring up on these things. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Then there's 2018 paper from Lucas et al. This is now they're starting to get a little better understanding of what's going on. Remember, the whole thread of all of this stuff is that they're working out how the systems run. Staufen turns out to mediate messenger RNA decay, and that similar structures have been developed convergently in the human and mouse genomes. And, quote, this demonstrated that sign-directed SMD likely emerged in both primate and rodent lineages around 20 to 25 million years ago. So this is a long-standing design element, if it was designed. So sometime back, long before our species originated, the designer was kind of tinkering around with stuff that was going to eventually end up gunking around making diseases. Maybe the designer was away on vacation later and forgot to take notice of it. These are not the kinds of issues that are ever going to be developed by the Discovery Institute way of looking at the world, which anticipating is actually going to connect up to that whole anthropic discussion, which I'll be getting to in my inserted part 3. And then the final paper on the field is the only one that's recent, 2020, Dinghai, Zheng et al., which identified where some of the ALUs were in that mix, but not that they were really apparently doing anything. They're just acting as things where the systems are triggering off and compensating for them. So it's basically all sort of the same shtick. So anthropic argument. That's the section that I'm currently working on in the new book. And part of the thing that we're going after is the privileged planet, which is one of the big works in this field. Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards, they're coming from an intelligent design perspective. And in fact, a friend of mine here had been greatly impressed by that back in his creationism days. So he had read the book. What's intriguing about it is how fabulously vague it is on the details. And what it turns out is that virtually all the discussions in this area at the apologetic theological level tend to be really, really vague. They'll say that a particular thing has been fine-tuned, and if it were a little more, there'd be a terrible thing happening, and if it were a little bit less, there were a terrible thing happening. But they won't be specific about just exactly how much is up and down? What's the range for it? So in compiling my chart, I realized I needed to pin that down. And most all of the examples, we were able to pin down some ranges on them. And it turned out that I had to figure out what was to go on the list, for one thing, because there are a ton of constants and people have written on it, but actually only a relatively small number of them are kind of big stars on the topic. And so there were 6 that were brought up by Martin Rees back in the early 2000s in his 6 numbers book. And one of which involved the number of spatial dimensions, which is kind of a weird thing to discuss because there's a good option to indicate, how can you vary the number of physical dimensions? Can they vary? Can there be 4-dimensional physical space? You can imagine hyperdimensions that are not altering the fact that we still have just 3 physical dimensions. You can imagine some things which you still have a time dimension, but there's other dimensions that relate to it. But apparently there's a good enough argument to be made that anything other than 3 is a mess. And so I don't actually put that on the main list, but there were a bunch of others that I did want to put in. And so we've got the part of the mix that was in Martin Rees involved the density parameter, fusion efficiency, the tomb ray stability, which connects up to the galactic gravitation, the electromagnetic versus the gravity ratio. And some of the people that write on this subject reverse it. So they will be saying the gravity versus EM. So you'd have to put the number backwards, divide it to find out what the concept is. And then the cosmological constant, which connects up with dark energy issues. I also added on 3 to the 5 that were being discussed. 2 of them, the fine structure and constant, which relates to electromagnetic interactions, and the proton-electron ratio, which relates to atomic structure, turns out to be curiously absent from Ries's list. And maybe because Max Born had said that it was those 2 were actually the most important ones that generated most all of the particles. And once you understand those, you understand all the rest is just kind of following naturally from it. So I put them on the list. And then another one was the one that was popping up in the details were in a footnote, a lengthy footnote in The Privileged Planet, which related to the carbon alpha resonance. And this connects up with Fred Hoyle supposedly predicting a particular resonance, which turned out to be super duper true. Turns out that he hadn't actually made any anthropic views on this, and there's a big long history on the whole matter. But the main thing that I was trying to figure out was how much can any of these little things vary. The proton-electron ratio and the density parameter turns out either to not matter if it varies at all, or maybe that it can't vary, or that it may have varied slightly at various times in history. But I couldn't find any discussion, including in The Privileged Planet, where they were saying what the range was that would be outside the boundaries. But the other 5, I was able to find material for. And so I ended up constructing, we'll put it up for you to kind of look at slow. This is the thing as it is in the moment. You'll see the little boxes on the side relate to the ones that Max Born was bringing up, and the big black box around the edge are the ones that turn out to have measurable values and not necessarily ginormous. Not one of the main ones can you argue that the variation has to be like a billionth either way, that kind of a thing. Nothing is that hair-splitty precise. The most precise one is the carbon alpha resonance, the one that was made such a big deal in the Privileged Planet book. It runs at around under 1% either way. That's the one that's close. The next, diffusion efficiency, turns out to have a range of about 15%. And the next one, the fine structure constant, runs from 25% to 60% either way. The tomb ray stability suddenly jumps up to an order of magnitude on the downside and on the upside. And then the electromagnetic gravity ratio goes to 3 orders of magnitude on the downside and 200% on the upside. And then the spectacularly wide example is the cosmological constant, which turns out to have a variation from 10 to the 10th on the downside and 10 to the 5th, the smaller branch up on the upside. That's not exactly what I would call razor thin fine tuning. And plus, there's a bunch of background information on the little details of how the stuff got worked out, and how various apologists over the years have kind of wriggled around a lot of these little sidebar issues. So it was an intriguing story for me to venture into, because it's been presented by so many apologists in so many ways. You get bits and pieces of anthropic stuff in Hugh Ross's apologetics. It pops up in William Lane Craig's column argument. It's less popular, oddly enough, or maybe not oddly enough, among young Earth creationists, because so much of the details of this are knee-deep in standard cosmology and standard astrophysics and all of the stuff that involves the Big Bang and standard relativity theory and all of that. And so their arguments, the traditionalist creationist fine-tuning arguments, tend to be very generic about why the Earth is in the position it is and the moon is just the size it needs to be to do such and so, and that sort of thing. And this has a long tradition in creationist apologetics. But the specific cosmological physics thing is a relatively recent development. It really was kind of kicking in the late 70s and the early 1980s, although the roots of it go a little bit earlier. There's a marvelous paper by the historian Helga Krag, who is just delicious in going into meticulous details about where some of the material comes from, including, we'll be citing her in the new book, on how the Big Bang term came about and what Hoyle's role was in this. It turns out the typical approach would have been that he was giving it as a disparaging insult and then it stuck. But actually, he wasn't even using it in an insulting way to begin with, and it kind of got picked up on stuff. So there's an awful lot of fascinating little history to go on in these matters. And we'll be doing a little bit of a fresh spin about why that all that anthropic reasoning has a set of buried assumptions in it that will be illustrating the nature of, not just with the physical constants that we'll be going into, but with a counterpart issue that's way older than any physics discussion, and that is mathematics. Why is the universe mathematical? How much of it's mathematical? Can the mathematics be varied? This is far worse about fine-tuning. 1 + 1 is not approximately 2. You can't fine-tune it to be, well, what if 1 + 1 was 2.3? Those are meaningless questions. Those things can't be other than what they are. Plus, there are limitations in things. One of the examples that we were bringing up was the binomial formula for working out the roots of a secondary polynomial. That you can do that for the 3rd and 4th degree polynomials, but you can't do it for 5th or higher. And it's not just hard, it's impossible in principle. And so theoretically, no gods could ever do that either. No universe can be made in which there is a root formula for a 6th degree polynomial, which is simply to take the formula and you plug the numbers into a root formula, and it'll tell you if it does or does not strike the x-axis, and if so, exactly where. Theoretically, a god could work through all possible variations to do that, but you're not going to be able to give a root formula. And then the other fun one is e to the pi I power plus 1 equals 0, which relates a bunch of fundamental numbers, including I, the imaginary number, the square root of -1. Why is that so? Can any universe be made in which that isn't true? Why is it true? Nobody knows. Nobody can say. There's no logical argument to account for why that is, but it is. They can prove that that is, in fact, the relationship. But why is it so? Puzzle. So why shouldn't physical constants in our universe, especially if the universe is functionally mathematical, be the same way? The fine-tuning is that there's a big control panel. In fact, the book in question, let's see if I find the page where that was used. They actually stuck. Come on, there we go. They even created a little control panel where the poor hapless little reader is adjusting the little knobs. But in fact, why would you assume that they aren't presets, that there's no adjustments allowed, even by gods? All of that, there's just pile. And why are the things that are on there as opposed to something else? All of that is a set of buried assumptions, which, incidentally, Gonzalez and the other works that go into this just don't think about it. They don't get far enough into thinking about the structural assumptions. They're so busy defending the control panel variables that they're not realizing that there's a problem with why they imagine that there's a control panel with just those on it to begin with. Or why can't you have completely different factors that are different from gravity? Are they trying to tell gods what they can and cannot do? Well, if the universe is mathematical and things are related the way they are, maybe the gods can't adjust it at all. So that's going to be material that's going to be discussed in greater length in Rocks for There, and it's a real fun little thing to go on. I still got a stick in the Oklo reactor, natural reactor, which relates to, I think, the fine structure constant that's been confirmed in there. And we got all that little stuff on that, plus knocking into a cocked hat some of the ideas about radioactive decay varying, which accelerated radioactive decay is all about. So it knocks an awful lot of props out on that. Let me stick up our thank you note for our Patreon, who help us every month. I must thank you all for that. Makes it much easier each month to be able to scrape by in our complicated little world. So thank you, all of our colleagues and researchers and assistant researchers, friends and legacy patrons over the years who have helped out in one way or the other. We greatly appreciate it, just as we greatly appreciate all of those who buy and talk about our various books where we are working on. And so we'll see where we are when we jump in. Oh, hello, Brian. Yay. I was a little late going on the thing, but that's because we're busy beavers, working the different projects and connecting up the little dots. In fact, just a few minutes before I went on the air, I was adding a little bit to the draft for our section on, there's a little bit on creationists claiming stuff about rapid lithification and rock formation, where there's just nothing in the creationist literature that can be thought of as legitimate. And just a couple of days ago, Vice Rhino did a little video where it's wonderful having other people follow other people that I get this stuff that otherwise I would have to watch every bloody video that existed. But anyway, Vice Rhino was following the ICR, and Tim Clary was on there, and he made the mistake of riffing off of a 2016 paper on injecting carbon dioxide into the earth as a way of carbon sequestration for climate science issues. And that supposedly this was making limestone down in the rock in a matter of years. Well, no, it didn't. The paper, it made kind of a chalky gunk down there, but no, it wasn't turning it into limestone in the way of a limestone block that you would use to build the pyramids from. And there is simply zero evidence that any creationist is adduced. They can deal with things like the lamination issue that Berthold plays around with, but getting to that stage of, can something turn into rock that if you hit them over the head with it, it would make a big bump? Can that happen fast? And no. In fact, limestone is a terrible example to deal with, because it takes a good 10,000 years or more just to squeeze the water out of it, as has been pointed out in a recent publication in a creationist journal by a non-creationist, Creation Science Research Quarterly on that. We will be alluding to it in volume 2. Perhaps somebody will be trying to respond to that. I'm not aware of anybody yet on that topic, but we'll we'll keep things informed. We want our reference bibliography to be as up to date as possible. So anyway, got any questions for us on the show, Brian? It's been a warmer day here in Spokane. You can see I'm not in my usual sweater. And whether or not it's been raining heavily for the last few days, which is fine. I don't have to worry about watering the lawn. Eventually, I'll have to get my little electric mower out there and clean off the back of the backyard. But for the time being, we're kind of muddling along as we are in the middle of Memorial Day weekend. It's going to be fun to see when the markets reopen on Tuesday, as to how they'll be reacting to the latest chaos from the Trump administration. We're still in holding pattern mode, in my view, as we run off the last steam of the Biden administration. Eventually, there's going to be matters about supply chain problems and slowness to restore supply chains. Companies that will be reluctant to try to fill certain orders, and Trump, who doesn't build anything, he's not a guy who manufactures. At 3:45 a.m. here. So you're farther down the line over there. You must be on the East Coast. Trump, who has never made anything, he's not like Henry Ford making cars or Bill Gates making computers. He is just a real estate developer, largely hyped and often failed. And then he's now got his brand. We'd know a little bit more about his cash flow and what percentage of it comes from just being a brand if we had his tax returns to look at. But remember, he guards those like Fort Knox. So we don't know one way or the other on that one. But he is making decrees as his brain deteriorates into dementia. And I mean that literally. He talks much slower than he used to. And he's just rattling on and on. If you listen to that catastrophe of a speech that he had at the commencement at, I think, West Point, holy shit. He's just repeating the same mantras over and over and over again, wandering off to digressions. And this is only going to get more and more pronounced and catastrophic as he moves on. And because he's addicted to these things that he can't then change his mind on, he's going to be digging in his heels on matters about cryptocurrency. This is certainly an area that I think has all the earmarks of generating a giant stock market crash bubble before the year is out. And it's going to be a funky little time to watch there. Plus the stresses from the agricultural system as they've been rounding up migrants, plus this inflationary stress from all of these tariffs all over the place, taking on our various allies and others. Whether the rest of the world, in fact, kind of bypasses a lot of this stuff, as I've alluded to in previous episodes as a historian. I'm very intrigued to see. We'll be doing a natural experiment to compare the bad reactions that were taking place in the nations that were all disconnected and rivals back in the 1930s that turned a serious economic crisis that stemmed from the United States in 1929 into a cataclysmically bad global depression. And although you did have the British Empire in those days, Europe, the major economies of Europe were all highly fragmented. Well, today we have the European Union, which together has, 350 million people in it. No, more than that, 400 some odd million, 450 million. In other words, it's as big as the United States and Russia combined. And that's not including Ukraine or Britain. That's kind of now starting to ease a little bit closer. So there may be a variety of mechanisms and trade issues that are going on. If there's agreements going on eventually between the British Commonwealth and the European Union, that could put a very different dynamic on stuff. And to see whether or not the Chinese can keep track of stuff, to see what happened with Africa, which has over the last half decade or more has disconnected itself from a lot of trade dependence on the United States. China still has a heavy trade connection to us. Whether or not they can make up the difference if tariffs really get out of hand is another matter that's uncertain. They've got all sorts of little systemic problems in China. 20% youth unemployment systemically, that's not a nice thing for them. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the world that's going to make it very interesting dynamic to see what tracks the same or different from what was going on in the 1930s and 40s. and I don't want things to go down the old bunghole of that. We can tolerate globally the United States getting into a conniption fit if we don't drag everybody else down with us. And then you expunge the Trump administration and the Republicans. The masses of them need to be voted out of office and rendered obsolete as we then start doing really full out reforms in trust busting and other things that we're really long overdue for to get us back onto track to a much more efficient and egalitarian economic system. Things that to address not only national health care, but also affordable housing. There's a lot of stuff that's going on. And that kind of reform, I think there's enough bright people out there, but none of them on the Republican side. They've imploded into crazy train territory. And they're just going to be wheel spinning the layers until they're out of power. So that's my prophecy. And we'll see how that works out and what's going to be happening. Because if you look at the difference between 1928, when Hoover was elected with a great confidence, in 1932, he's out. And there's been a ginormous sea change in the economy in that 4 years. Same thing can happen this time with all sorts of prospects as to what's going on. So anyway, let me put up my little Roxworth ad for the advert for the first book. Naturally, we will assume that everybody on the planet should, by rights, want to have a copy of the book, and when the second one comes out, a copy of that too, because it's the work that pulls apart more aspects of the creationism angle. Jackson's goal was that we would be writing effectively the definitive coverage of the subject, such that we don't need to talk about it again. In the sense that if you say, okay, here's the thing, look into Roxworth there in the 2 volumes. We cover everything and offer adequate reason to regard all of that creationist twaddle and intelligent design twaddle as twaddle. So we can move on to other interesting little topics, which we will be doing in subsequent books, discussing things like why climate science denialism is such a mess and dangerous, why issues of gender equality and other matters that are such idiot talking points that are dividing people shouldn't be doing so. There's a lot of going on. And so that's likely to be the coverage for our next volume. And then after that, job losses have skyrocketed, not counting the Doge firings. Yeah, there's going to be a throughput through the year. Some benchmarks to look at will be where conditions are around 4th of July. If we follow the track of 1929, 1930, expect a serious speed bump by autumn. And remember, the Great Depression didn't happen all at once. You had the big debacle of 1929 turned out to be kind of like only the tip of the iceberg. And there was a while through the early part of 1930 when it looks like maybe the Hoover administration was going to be able to kind of handle things. But then, oops, things really fell apart. And it continued to fall apart to where you had the banking crisis that was hitting just as Roosevelt was coming in. That, for anybody that's seen the old It's a Wonderful Life, the bank crisis where the Bailey Savings and Loan is practically run out of money, and old man Potter is trying to buy up everything in town during that period. That's referring to that banking crisis. Whether or not we're going to be having counterparts of all of that stuff in this crisis and how it'll be working out. We have a very different environment in terms of electronic banking. We have smartphones, we have communication networks and transportation networks that are very different from before. Will Rogers made the joke about how the people in the Depression were the first people that drove to the poorhouse in a car. Well, we moved beyond car stages. Now these are the first ones that will find out more about our economic despair on an app. Food's still climbing in price, although apps have established it around $8. Eggs. Yes, the Yeah, maybe F's. Those F and eggs. Yeah, that the serious things are going to be coming as a lot of crops cannot be harvested because ice is scaring undocumented workers underground. And in fact, this can affect areas other than the construction industry. Housing construction, used blocks of that rely on undocumented workers. The furniture company that's the biggest employer in Marjorie Taylor Greene's home district is heavily dependent on undocumented labor. So there's just stuff all over the place. And because the Trumpistas are the most Tortugan minds you can imagine, as in tunnel vision. Christy Nome doesn't even know what the hell habeas corpus is. You've got crazy trained screwballs like Kash Patel and others that are in the administration. This shoots off the index. You had problems in prior times. General Grant, his terms, there were things involving his brother-in-law. You had the Credit Mobilier scandal during that period. You had a long tradition of muckraking fraud going on in the Democratic Party with Tammany Hall, the machine that ran San Francisco with tremendous corruption all the way into the 20th century, the Pendergrast bunch in Missouri that Harry Truman came out of and worked past. The Teapot Dome material from the Harding administration. But by and large, no one has accused Calvin Coolidge of being personally corrupt, kind of clueless in some respects, but not personally corrupt. Nixon, of all people, was not a financially corrupt person. He had many flaws other than that, but making money at public expense was not one of his sins. Blueberries and tomatoes rotting, even though they have offered a staggering $1 an hour. Yes, exactly. And so there's this throughput in the agricultural sector that's going to be hitting stuff to where for that which is available, prices are going to be getting higher and higher and higher. And so everybody's going to be watching. For those who aren't following Marketplace on radio, do it. Assuming, of course, that your local NPR station has it available. Marketplace has been on for years and years, decades. And Kaya Risdal is the current person involved in that. And it's always honest and reliable and meticulous and explaining things well. And you get economic analysis on PBS on the News Hour from I think Solomon is the fellow that does the analyses on there, and they explain things as well. By and large, that kind of open the hood to see what's going on. The details doesn't occur in regular media, and certainly doesn't occur over in Crazy Train, Fox Trump Pravda, and OAN and Newsmax. They're operating purely at propaganda level. So yes, thanks a while for the morning meds to kick in. But anyway, I recommend finding that on, and you can get it on apps. Marketplace and the like are ones you can find NPR radio while we still have public broadcasting and radio. To be fair, it's possible that even attempts to pull the economic plug from them at the federal level won't make it go away, because you've got most of the resources that the public system runs off of aren't from the federal government. So it makes a dent in their operation, but that doesn't mean it's going to stop. So we've got a complex thing unless they try to, stop the broadcast licenses and all the rest. But then you've got end run systems that are running through the internet and various other modes. So information suppression is nothing to do, and it is a dangerous thing for a society to get into. Because the moment you get into the state and you can control the sources of information, you get into Russia or the PRC, where they have a state media and that they will try to prevent information that conflicts with the model or not. I don't need wooden penguins. My hands are wood most of the time. Yes. Well, as I said, keep an eye out for the wooden penguins. Keep an eye out for all the little problems on the taco-shaped earth and all of those little sidebars. But try to keep amused. While I've been working on all my various projects and stuff, I've also been catching up on masses. It turns out huge blocks of Mystery Science Theater 3000 are available freebie on the internet on YouTube. And I had seen big chunks of the show when it was on live back in the day in the 90s and that. And then it got switched over to cable and stuff. So quite a lot of the ones, more recent episodes that Patton Oswalt is even one of the little cast members on that. So a lot of that stuff now is available to watch. They typically run about an hour and a half. And once you get used to the little opening intro, you can jump ahead if you want to have it even a little bit shorter. But God, they're deliciously funny. They're droll. They're just a cornucopia. As an old movie groupie, I absolutely adore the in jokes that will be in there. And in fact, an older person like me gets a lot out of the stuff because they're connecting up with so many things, that there are so many in jokes in there that would relate to what would be on television from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, that are ancient history to a lot of young people. So they won't actually be able to get a hell of a lot of the jokes. And they relate to everything from theater to motion pictures. They're little bits where you realize, oh my God, that's a reference to It's a Wonderful Life, or it's an allusion to a particular musical or whatever. And the films range from middling B movies from the 1950s and 60s to absolutely ghastly messes that you wonder why anybody went to the trouble of making some of these just awful things. Some of them are like originally direct to video. Some of them are really cheesy little things. Some of them are foreign films. One of the ones that always stuck in my head, and I was finally able to see the episode that it related to again, was I think it was like a Scandinavian film that's been dubbed into English, and it was all about these mythological characters and making the sampo. It was this kind of flaming thing that was involved with the magical lore and all of that. And it's just a delightful little sidebar. So if you want something besides getting my books, the Paralogs of Fog story, as a way of escaping the terrible times that we're going through to keep your imagination going, I can heartily recommend Mystery Science Theater 3000, MS3K, MST3K. I'll mention that I put a shameless plug in on Paralogs because one of the final installment that Dapper Dino has been doing on Bodhi Hodge's monstrosity on the Tower of Babel with Vishanti and Alexis Dahl's a good YouTube channel. She covers stuff in a nice way. Yeah, there's an awful lot of wonderful little people out there that are doing the same sort of thing that I'm trying to do, of putting some knowledge and maybe a little bit of humor along the way. Anyway, Kip Davis and that's involved in that autopsy of Bodhi Hodge. I think his book came out like in 2013, but they read through line by line, section by section, and were commenting on the terrible factual mistakes and clumsy writing. I mean, it's just a huge array of material on it. But in the last episode, Kip Davis apparently is quite a Great Eastern groupie. Isambard Kingdom Brunel's great big ship from the 19th century. And I said, heck, I got to shamelessly plug Paralogs because the Great Eastern figures in the story. And for those who have never actually been to that great ocean liner, I had to do a pile of research on what the interior was like for my story. So if you get Paralogs 1, the villains of the piece have hired the Great Eastern to try to retrieve Impey Barbicane's Columbiad projectile, and all sorts of adventures take place in and around it and down in its innards and all the other little fun and game that's going on. And so it's a vivid recreation of what was in that grand little liner that was the great white elephant of the time and the biggest ship long past its ceasing to exist. It was broken up in the 1880s, and at 690 feet, nothing was built that big until I think 1899. And so it was an amazingly audacious thing for Brunel to do. He dropped dead before the ship was actually launched. It was launched sideways in the Thames. It was one of the last big ships to be done that way because it was so ginormous. They couldn't launch it endways. They had to launch it sideways. And it had a bunch of teething pains. It laid the transatlantic cable and the cable to Bombay, which we allude to in Paralogs 1. All of these little things are syncing up, and inside of the ship, the interior had been gutted to have big drums to hold the cables. So scenes actually take place in relation to a rather tense gunfight that takes place in one of the empty cable drums aboard the thing. So anyway, links to all the books as usual are in every single episode. So anybody that wants to take the plunge, once I get the links in on there, they can go click, boop. And the books, all 4 books are available in either print version or in ebooks on Kindle. And then we're slogging along. Rocks 2 is taking the high priority for my writing, but Paralogs 3 is in the works. I'm about a quarter of the way through it. Third of the way through it. And then once I get the rocks where they're done, I'll be able to dive in. So I suspect Paralogs 3 will be out in 26. So we'll see how that goes. Have you seen the Jackie Chan version? Yes, it's not a great movie, but not a bad one. And Jackie Chan is just fun and as all get out. It's a very fictionalized plot with terrible anachronisms all the way through the bloody thing. But it's a fun little romp. It's not a terribly long movie. I think it was a little over like 2 hours ish. And it has a bunch of little fun and games that are going on. I mean, my God, the Wright brothers show up, and they're various little cameo bits along the way. But it's an absolute train wreck of historical anachronisms where they've got stuff taking place in the unfinished Statue of Liberty in Paris when, in fact, the head wouldn't have been there and the arm wouldn't have been there. And I can't accuse them of being meticulous. Plus, the Wright brothers can't possibly be showing up in the story because they would only be like kids at the time. So everything about it, they're just kind of mushing together historical details in ways that suggest that they haven't checked the dates. It kind of floats around as to, is it in the 1870s, the 80s, the 90s? When exactly is it? So it's a muck from that direction. But it's not an unentertaining little romp. Phileas Fogg is almost pushed into being a secondary character in the thing because it's Jackie Chan who is bumping into the story as the kind of Passepartout-ish element. And I think he's chasing after people who I can't remember whether somebody had kidnapped a love of interest of his or something. He was chasing after something or other. It was an arbitrary plot. A more meticulous rethink is the more recent one. Then supposedly they're going to be doing more Jules Verne stories, but the one with Daniel Tennant from the old Doctor Who series, among other things. And it completely pulled the story apart. And apart from following kind of the same itinerary, it was a totally fresh storyline. And it had a few little historical anachronisms in it. But overall, I found that one an entertaining flick. That was done, I think, on the BBC. One of the little anachronisms in the Tennant version has to do with them sailing out on the Henrietta, which they've turned into this like 1890s era ocean liner. No, it was a little small freighter. And they pass by the under construction Brooklyn Bridge, which wasn't there. No, the towers weren't even finished. They were just starting on those in 1872. And so the thing where they're showing the towers and the starting to put the cabling across, no, 1877, kids, wrong period. The Golden Buddha. Yeah, there we go. But yeah, I'd say that there's been several versions. There was also one that another James Bond did, Pierce Brosnan did on television. One of the things that's a little amusement, and the Daniel Tennant one made the same bit. The film version, in fact, quite ironically, some people were over, and I was showing Around the World in 80 Days, the David Niven film from 1956, just today. That Michael Todd movie had tinkered with the plot in several very ingenious ways, condensing a lot, but 2 big things. One, the balloon flight, which is not in the book, and it became so famous and it's so perfect that often books, including the little copy that I had as a kid, had a balloon on the cover. And several of the versions, including the Daniel Tennant one, has a balloon flight in it, even though it's not in the book. And then the other maneuver that was fiendishly clever in the film version was to eliminate or modify the little wind sled that figured in the story. And because they moved the whole plot in the movie, the 56 movie, forward 3 months, so it wasn't taking place in the winter, that the utter implausibility of an ice sledge being able to work with a sail. I guess Verne was thinking that Nebraska and the like were way flatter than they actually are. It was just impossible. And so for the film, they made an ingenious solution, which was to have a handcar on the tracks and have the sails attached to that. So it became a wind car on the tracks. And it's a perfect resolution to the thing. I think if Verne had known about the idea, he would have used it. Oh yeah, I'd say that anachronisms, even in historical recreations. Yeah, the thing that I look for in films are terminology failures and chronological anachronisms. And it's really easy, especially for modern writers, to fall into dialogue anachronisms. And so people will be using the phrase okay or something like that. They all talk like contemporary young people. And that's can be a catastrophic mistake if you're trying to get into a period detail. In other areas, they just kind of mush up getting the period wrong. And it's not necessarily due to monumental incompetence, because some of these things are hard to track down, but yet, yeah, they take some trouble to deal with. So you get things, two of the things that I love to look for are chess sets and phonograph records. Chess sets prior to 1850 cannot look like the classic Staunton chess set because it hadn't been invented yet. And so there are occasional bits where I'll see, this is usually the case in older things that were done like in the 30s and 40s. There's stuff like Voltaire playing with a chess set, and it's of Staunton's chess set. It's just wrong. Or Napoleon, that kind of thing, because he dies decades before the Staunton set was designed. Phonograph records are the tricky bit, which is the difference between the cylinder records that were the first ones and flat records, the Berliner records that came in 1906. And you get little bits and pieces on that. Automobiles. Curiously, there was one, the Vienna Blood series that was really very effectively done about this psychoanalyst in 1903, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 period Vienna, and it's been on for quite a few seasons. And it has a lot of the issues about the racism of the period and all of the cultural tumult and stuff that's going on. And they're really quite interesting little stories. But what intrigued me was never seeing a car. And only in the very last season, the fourth one, did I finally see somebody drive an automobile in Vienna. I mean, that's anybody that was wealthy would have access to that burgeoning status symbol. And I think it was in part because it's filmed, I think, in Hungary or the like, to where they've got the rental on the carriages, and they didn't want to acquire, because period automobiles from that very early period are not a dime a dozen. And the earlier you do, the less likely that somebody would be driving, say, a Mercedes Simplex or something like that. So, hello, yes, hello, Purple. Yeah, we were just discussing historical anachronisms in various historical productions. Probably the most obscure one I have ever heard was back in college. Dr. Zhivago had just come out a few years earlier, and there was a student in the agriculture department, and they were informing me, and I have never checked out whether it was absolutely accurate, but nonetheless, they noticed that there were fields appearing in Dr. Zhivago that were plowed in ways that were inaccurate for that particular period. And I go, okay, there we go. Those sorts of things are hyper trivial. One thing that impressed me about Around the World in 80 Days, the David Niven film, is that they were very meticulous in the details. So the trains are correct for the period. When the famous thing where they're seeing the balloon flying over Paris in the early part of the story, if you look really carefully, nothing on the screen is historically jarring for 1872. They are pointedly never turning if they turned the camera at one point just slightly over there, you would have seen the Eiffel Tower. And so they make the point of not doing that. And the Gare du Nord that figures in the story where fog arrives in Paris, the Gare du Nord had opened up in 1870 and was still around operating at the time, 1872. The one thing they don't deal with, and I don't really start addressing some of the sidebars to it until the third fog novel, is that Paris was still recovering from the Franco-Prussian War, and so there was an awful lot of damage and stuff done. In fact, the third novel has a little bit about the big new Grand Opera, the Palais Garnier, and there's a big Palais Place de l'Opera that runs down today to the Seine to connect up to stuff, and that was finished in time for the 1878 exposition, but it wasn't there. I have storyline taking place in like 1873, 74, 75, 76, and it was still just jumbled construction. They hadn't actually built that section of road yet. These were little sidebar details that I had to uncover in trying to work out all of my stuff. So anyway, good God, we made it to an hour. So anyway, once the links are all in, there will be material on the Casey Luskin episode today. Plus, people can look closely at my little discussion on the fine-tuning chart that's going to be in the new book. And all the material on their stupid taphonomy stuff. And then we will be seeing you kids next week. And in another 2 weeks, we'll have another Casey Luskin episode as we plow our way down through. It's going to take a long time because by doing it every other week and doing maybe 3 or 4 papers at most, typically on average, it'll take a while because they've got supposedly like 800 some odd papers on the list, of which I've spotted a couple double dips, but that's relatively trivial. Even at that bit, they don't give an actual full number. So we'll be able to see exactly how many there are on the list. And we will know directly when it's all done, exactly how it doesn't help their case. Because so far there have been 0 papers, and we're already over 100, that support the prime contention that Luskin and company have been offering, which is that somewhere on the order of 50%-ish, if not more, of the junk DNA is actually functional. And none of those papers are allowing that justification. The fact that that crowd thought that this vomit of papers would do it just by sheer volume, maybe? Well, I'm going through every effing one of them. And we'll be allowing everybody, the vast majority of them turn out to be ones that are available full text. And everybody can look into them and make their own decisions on the point if anybody wants to dispute. I haven't heard anybody over the times that I've done this bringing up any criticisms as to whether or not I'm overstating my case on these little things, but have at it if so. So anyway, everybody stay safe. Watch out for the wooden penguins. We will continue in this year of doom 2025 and see where we are. And shameless plug, get the books. And if you have even more scratch available, get some copies to donate to your public library so that everybody can read those as well. And spread the word if you know people in the book review biz or other little niches that would like either the fiction end or the science end. Let them know about the thing. I don't have an advertising budget. I don't have connections on all of that stuff. It's all by word of mouth. I know that roughly 1,000 people on the planet have copies of the 2 science books, so proceed accordingly. So anyway, see you next week, kids.